You probably could not load Twitter on the 21st of October 2016, or Spotify, or Netflix, or Reddit, or PayPal. If you were online that Friday, you remember how strange it felt. More than 80 major services went dark, in waves, for most of a working day, across North America and Europe. The weapon that did it was not a government, it was not a supercomputer, and it was not a room full of people. It was about 100,000 ordinary household devices, security cameras, video recorders, baby monitors, home routers, things sitting in living rooms doing their normal job while also attacking the internet. By the end of this episode, you will know exactly how that worked, why it can still happen, and the 2 things worth checking on your own network tonight. You will also find out why the 3 young men who built that weapon were never charged with this particular attack. That part of the story is stranger than the attack itself. Start with what it looked like from the outside, because from the outside it made no sense. Friday morning, East Coast of the United States. People start reporting that Twitter will not load, not slow, not an error message from Twitter, just nothing, as though the site had stopped existing. Then Spotify, then Reddit, then Netflix, GitHub, Airbnb, PayPal, Etsy, SoundCloud, the PlayStation Network, and dozens more. The pattern was baffling because these companies have nothing to do with each other. They are competitors. They run on different clouds in different countries with different engineers. There is no button that turns off Twitter and Netflix at the same time. They do not share a building or a cable or a company. And they were not, in fact, down. This is the part that confused people for hours. Twitter's servers were running normally the whole time. Netflix was fine. The videos were sitting there ready to be served. The websites were up. People just could not find them. To understand that sentence, you need to understand the one piece of internet plumbing almost nobody thinks about until it breaks. When you type a website name, that name is not an address. It is a label for humans. The actual address is a number, a string of digits that identifies a specific machine on the network. Your computer does not know that number. It has to ask. The system it asks is called DNS, the domain name system, and the usual way to describe it is as the phone book of the internet. That analogy is fine as far as it goes, but it undersells the problem. So let me sharpen it. It is not a phone book you own. It is a directory inquiry service you have to phone up every single time before you can call anybody. Every visit, every app refresh, every image on a page from a different domain. Ask the directory, get a number, then connect. So if directory inquiry stops answering, every number in the world still works perfectly, and you cannot reach a single one of them. That is exactly what happened on the 21st of October. Now, who runs directory inquiries? Big companies do not usually run their own. They pay a managed DNS provider because it needs to be fast, worldwide, and never, ever offline. One of the best regarded of those providers was a company called DIN, based in Manchester, New Hampshire. DIN was not a small operation. It handled DNS for a large slice of the modern internet, and its customer list is the list of names that went dark that day. And here's the structural point, the one that makes this episode worth 30 minutes of your time. All of those competing, independent, redundantly engineered companies had quietly made the same outsourcing decision. Each of them had built their own systems to survive almost anything. Multiple data centers, backup power, failover across continents. And then each of them had pointed at the same directory service. So they were not competitors with separate risks. They were a single point of failure wearing 80 different logos. Nobody planned that. No one person could see it. It is what happens when thousands of sensible individual decisions all pick the same best supplier. That is the shape of most modern internet outages. And once you can see it, you will see it every time. There is one more piece of DNS you need, because it explains something that confused everybody on the day. The outage was patchy, wildly patchy. Two people in the same city, on the same provider, would find that one of them could use Twitter and the other could not. People assumed that meant the reports were exaggerated or that it was some regional routing problem. It was neither. It was caching. When your computer looks up an address, it does not throw the answer away. It keeps it for a while. So does your internet provider, on your behalf, for all of its customers. Each answer comes with a time limit attached called a time to live. It might be 60 seconds. It might be a day. The owner of the domain chooses. So during the attack, whether you could reach a site depended on something completely invisible to you. Whether your provider happened to still be holding a valid answer for it. If the cached answer was fresh, you sailed straight through and noticed nothing. If it had just expired, your provider had to go and ask DIN, and DIN could not answer. That is why the map of the outage looks so strange, and why the first hours were full of people telling each other it works fine for me. It also tells you something useful. Caching was the only thing standing between a bad Friday and a far worse one. The internet degraded unevenly instead of stopping, because millions of machines were still working from answers they had written down earlier. Now the weapon. A denial of service attack is conceptually the dumbest attack there is. You do not break in. You do not steal anything. You just send so many requests that the target cannot answer real ones. It is the internet equivalent of 100,000 people phoning a shop at once so no customer can get through. The difficulty has always been getting enough attackers. One machine cannot do it. You need an army, which means you need to control a lot of computers you do not own. For 20 years, that meant infecting personal computers, which is work. PCs have antivirus, they get patched, they get replaced, and people notice when they slow down. Then the world spent a decade putting a small computer inside everything and connecting it to the internet. Cameras, digital video recorders, routers, printers, thermostats, doorbells, baby monitors. Each one is a real computer, usually running a stripped-down version of Linux connected 24 hours a day on a home broadband line. And critically, each one is a computer that nobody thinks of as a computer. You patch your laptop, you do not patch your doorbell, you do not run antivirus on a digital video recorder. Most people have never logged into their router at all. Malware called. Mirai was written to take advantage of exactly that gap. And its method was almost insultingly simple. It did not use a clever exploit. It did not need a software flaw at all. It scanned the internet looking for devices with a login prompt open, and then it tried to log in with the factory default username and password. That is it. That is the whole attack. The list it worked from was around 60 username and password pairs. Admin and admin, root and root, root and the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, support and support. Those are not guesses. Those are the credentials manufacturers ship devices with, printed in manuals that are freely available online. And they work at enormous scale because changing them is optional. And optional security is security almost nobody does. When Mirai got in, it loaded itself into memory and started doing two things: waiting for orders and scanning for the next device. Every machine it took became a machine hunting 4 more machines. That is why it grew in hours instead of months. It was also careful to be quiet. Mirai lived in memory, which meant it left almost nothing on the device itself. It killed rival malware it found on the same machine to keep the device for itself. And because it lived in memory, unplugging the device and plugging it back in would clean it. Which sounds like good news and is not, because a clean device with the factory password still set gets reinfected, in some measurements within minutes of coming back online. That is the trap. The fix that everybody knows how to do is temporary, and the fix that lasts is one almost nobody performs. The name, incidentally, is Japanese. Mirai means future. The author took it from an anime series which tells you something about who we are dealing with, and we will come back to that. There is one detail in the code that I find more revealing than anything else in this story. Mirai carried a list of internet address ranges it was told never to scan. It deliberately skipped them. On that list were the United States Postal Service, the Department of Defense, the organization that hands out internet addresses globally, and address ranges belonging to General Electric and Hewlett-Packard. Think about what that tells you. Whoever wrote this was not trying to attack the American government. They were specifically trying not to. That is not the behavior of a foreign intelligence service, and it is not the behavior of somebody who does not care what happens to them. It is the behavior of somebody running a business who knows exactly which doors you do not knock on, because knocking on those brings a response you cannot survive. Hold that thought, because when we get to who these people actually were, that single design decision will make complete sense. By the time it was done, Mirai had infected devices in more than 160 countries. Most of the owners never knew, and most of them still do not. Mirai did not appear on the 21st of October. There were 2 loud warnings first, and both were ignored by everyone except the people directly hit. On the 20th of September 2016, a website was hit with an attack of more than 620 gigabits per second. At that time, this was, by a wide margin, the largest attack of its kind that had ever been publicly recorded. The target was not a bank or a government, it was a blog, a one-man security news site called Krebs on Security, written by a journalist named Brian Krebs. Krebs had spent years reporting on the people who sell exactly these services. His writing had put people in prison. This was retaliation, and it was personal. The attack was so large that the company providing his protection for free could not justify absorbing it any longer, and his site went offline for several days. The company was Akamai, one of the largest infrastructure providers on Earth. They had been shielding him without charge for years. They did not drop him out of cowardice. They told him plainly that absorbing an attack of that size indefinitely for a customer paying nothing would cost them millions and start degrading service for customers who were paying. Sit with what that means. A single independent journalist attracted an attack so expensive that a multi-billion-dollar company had to work out whether it could afford to keep him online. And the answer was no. He was rescued by an unusual place. Google runs a service called Project Shield, which provides this protection free, but only to news organizations, human rights groups, and election monitors. Project Shield took his site, and it has held ever since. Krebs wrote an essay about it at the time, and the phrase he used has stuck. He called it the democratization of censorship. His point was uncomfortable and correct. It used to take a government to silence a publisher. Now it takes a teenager with enough hijacked cameras. And the only reliable defense available to a small publisher is to shelter under one of a handful of enormous companies, which is its own kind of problem for a free press. Sit with the scale of that. A single journalist was hit by an attack big enough that a major infrastructure provider had to let him go. Days later, a French hosting company called OVH reported being hit by an attack in a similar range, again from compromised cameras and recorders. So by the end of September, the security world had 2 clear demonstrations that somebody had built something that could take down almost anything. And then the situation got considerably worse. On the 30th of September, 2016, a user calling themselves Anna Senpai posted on a forum called Hack Forums. The post was the complete source code for Mirai, the whole thing, free, public, to anyone. The stated reason was that the security industry was closing in and that releasing it was the way out. It is worth understanding why that is such a consequential move, because it is the hinge of this entire story. First, the obvious effect. A weapon that one group controlled became a weapon anyone with moderate technical skill could build. Within weeks, there were many separate Mirai botnets, run by many separate people, competing with each other for the same pool of vulnerable devices. But the second effect is the clever one, and it is why the release happened. If only you have the weapon, then every attack using it points at you. Investigators work backwards from the tool to the tool maker. If everybody has the weapon, that line is cut. Attribution collapses. Releasing the code did not just spread it. It buried its author inside a crowd, and it did so 3 weeks before the biggest attack it would ever be used for. That timing is not a coincidence, and remember it, because it is the reason the ending of this story is so unsatisfying. The 21st of October, 2016. It came in 3 distinct waves. The first ran from about 11:10 in the morning, Universal Time, to about 1:20 in the afternoon. Dine's engineers saw it, identified it, and mitigated it. Service came back. Roughly 2 hours, start to finish, which for an attack of that size is a genuinely good response. Then, at about 10 to 4 in the afternoon, it came back. Different, larger, and aimed to work around the defense that had just been put up. And then a third time, from about 8 in the evening until 10 past 10. 3 realms is not a script kiddie pressing a button. Somebody was watching the defense, adapting, and hitting again. And the timing was not random either. This ran through a Friday working day in the United States and a Friday evening in Europe. Maximum audience, maximum noise. Consider what Dine's engineers were actually facing, because this is the genuinely hard part of the problem. In a normal denial of service attack, you identify the bad traffic and drop it. Filter by source, by pattern, by anything that separates the attack from the customers. Here, the attack was arriving from 100,000 residential addresses in 164 countries, which are exactly the addresses your customers live behind. Block a range and you have not stopped the attack, you have cut off a neighborhood of real users. There is no clean line to draw, and the requests themselves were valid DNS queries on the correct port. Individually, every single one looked like a person trying to reach a website. It is the difference between blocking a rock through a window and blocking 100,000 people who have each politely asked you a normal question at the same moment. The traffic was disguised. It came as TCP and UDP over port 53, which is the ordinary port DNS runs on, so it looked like legitimate lookups. That is what makes a DNS flood so nasty. You cannot simply block the traffic, because blocking it is the same as being down. Now, the numbers, and here is where we have to be careful, because the widely repeated figure is not one that Dine ever confirmed. You'll read that the attack peaked at 1.2 terabits per second. That number came from outside estimates. Dine's own statement said, and I quote it accurately, that there had been some reports of a magnitude in the 1.2 terabit range, and that at that time they were unable to verify that claim. Unable to verify is not the same as denying it, but repeating it as established fact is how a maybe becomes a legend, and this episode is not going to do that. What Dine did publish 5 days later was a post-mortem by Scott Hilton, their executive vice president of product, and it contains a genuinely surprising finding. Dine estimated the attack came from roughly 100,000 malicious endpoints, 100,000 infected devices. During the event, the number of source addresses looked vastly larger. It looked like tens of millions. The reason is a detail Hilton called a retry storm, and it is the most instructive thing in the whole incident. When a DNS lookup fails, the device that asked does not give up. It asks again. So does every other device and every other server in the chain automatically. So the moment Dine started struggling, hundreds of millions of entirely innocent computers, phones, and servers around the world began retrying their failed lookups. That legitimate retry traffic dwarfed the actual attack and hit the same already overloaded systems, which means the internet's own politeness, its built-in habit of trying again when something does not work, became the largest part of the flood. The attacker supplied 100,000 devices. The internet supplied the rest for free by behaving exactly as designed. That is why the honest engineering lesson from Dine is not use a bigger firewall. It is that a heavily interdependent system amplifies its own failures. So who did it? Almost immediately, claims of responsibility appeared. Groups using the names Anonymous, New World Hackers, and Spain Squad contacted journalists. The stated motive was revenge. because Ecuador had cut off internet access for the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and its London embassy. Very little evidence was ever offered for any of it, claiming a famous attack cost nothing, and the security world treated those claims as unproven. They remain unproven. There was also loud speculation that a nation-state was behind it, coming days before an American presidential election. That went nowhere too. The actual investigation went somewhere else entirely, and it started with the one person the attackers should have left alone. In January 2017, Brian Krebs published a very long piece titled, "Who is Anna Senpai?" the Mirai worm author. This is the journalist whose site they had taken off the internet 4 months earlier. He had spent those months working out who did it. He traced the online identities, the forum accounts, the handles reused across years, the Minecraft server businesses, the names in the chat logs, the connections between them. And he named Paras Ja, a student at Rutgers University in New Jersey, as the likely author behind Anna Senpai. He was right. The federal case, unsealed nearly a year later, matched what a reporter had already published using open sources and patience. There is a lesson in that which has nothing to do with computers. They attacked a journalist to make him stop writing, and the writing is what found them. And there was already a trail, because Ja had a history, and it was at his own university. Between 2014 and 2016, Rutgers was knocked offline repeatedly. The attacks kept landing at the worst possible moments, during exam periods and during registration for classes. The attacker taunted the university publicly while it was happening and mocked its response. Ja was a student there through part of that. He pleaded guilty separately to those attacks. For the Rutgers case, he was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest in order to pay $8.6 million in restitution. That is the fuller picture of who built this. Not a state actor. A student who attacked his own university during exams, then built something that reached 164 countries? So back to the federal case. What? In December 2017, court documents were unsealed in Alaska. 3 young men had pleaded guilty to creating and running Mirai. Paras, Ja, Josiah White, and Dalton Norman. At the time of the plea, they were 21, 20, and 21. They were not agents of a foreign power. They were not an organized crime syndicate. Their original business was Minecraft. That is not a joke, and it is not a small detail. Minecraft server hosting was a real market with real money in it. If you knock a rival Minecraft host offline, its players get frustrated and move to yours. And you can also sell protection against exactly the attacks you are running. So the largest denial of service weapon ever built at that point was built initially to win a commercial fight over game servers and to sell protection from itself. They later moved into click fraud using the botnet to fake advertising clicks, which is where the money was. They were sentenced in September 2018 in Anchorage. 5 years of probation each, 2,500 hours of community service, and $127,000 in restitution. No prison time. The reason for that leniency is on the record. They had by then spent hundreds of hours working with the FBI on other cybercrime investigations, and prosecutors described the cooperation as extraordinary. And now, the part this episode has been walking toward. Those 3 men were not held responsible for the attack on Dine. Prosecutors said they did not believe the 3 were behind it, and the stated reason is the one we set up earlier. By the 21st of October, the Mirai source code had been public for 3 weeks. Anyone could have built that botnet. The authors were, at that point, 3 suspects among thousands. In December 2020, another person pleaded guilty in a related Mirai matter, with their identity withheld because of their age at the time. But the specific attack that took Twitter, Netflix, Spotify, and Reddit off the internet for most of a day has never been publicly attributed to a named person. Nearly 10 years on, we know precisely how it was done. We know what it was done with. We do not know who did it. And the reason we do not know is a decision someone made 3 weeks earlier to give the weapon away. Before we get to what changed, there's a question worth asking that most coverage skipped entirely. The flaw here was known. It was not subtle. Default passwords on internet-connected devices had been a documented problem for years before 2016. So why did nobody fix it? And the answer is not laziness, it is economics, and it is worth understanding because it applies far beyond cameras. Think about who bears the cost of a badly secured camera. The manufacturer sells a $30 camera on a thin margin in a market where buyers compare on price and picture quality and nothing else. Adding proper security means engineering work, a way to deliver updates for years, and a support line for customers locked out of their own device. All cost on a $30 product. And the buyer does not reward it. Nobody in a shop has ever chosen a camera because it had a better password policy. It is not on the box, and it would not be believed if it were. Now here's the important part. When that camera is conscripted into a botnet, the owner mostly does not suffer either. The camera keeps working, the picture is fine, a little upload bandwidth goes missing, and that is all the owner ever sees. The harm lands on Dime, and on Twitter, and on Netflix, and on a journalist in Virginia, on people with no relationship to that camera whatsoever. Economists have a word for a cost that falls on somebody outside the transaction, an externality. This is a textbook one. The person who could prevent the harm has no incentive to. The person who suffers it has no ability to. And no amount of good advice fixes that, because the incentives are simply pointing the wrong way. That is precisely why this ended in legislation rather than in better products. Regulation is the standard tool for an externality, and it is a large part of why it took 8 years. And it is why telling individuals to be careful was never going to work on its own. There is no version of this where hundreds of millions of people voluntarily log into their doorbells. So what actually changed? Commercially, quite a lot and quickly. On the 21st of November 2016, 1 month after the attack, Oracle announced it was buying DIN. The reported price was north of $600 million. Being at the center of the most famous outage of the year did not destroy the company. The engineering lesson was learned properly. Large services now routinely use more than one DNS provider, so that losing one is survivable. That is now standard practice, and the 21st of October 2016 is a large part of why. The legal response took longer, and it went after the actual root cause, which was default passwords. California passed a law, Senate Bill 327, which took effect on the 1st of January 2020. It requires manufacturers selling connected devices in California to give each device a unique password, or to force the user to set one on first use. That is the whole Mirai attack, legislated out of existence, at least for new devices sold there. The United Kingdom went further and later. Its product security and telecommunications infrastructure regime came into force on the 29th of April 2024. It bans default and easily guessed passwords on consumer connectable products outright, and it was the first national law in the world to do so. 8 years between the attack and the British ban. That is the actual speed at which this kind of thing gets fixed. And the honest caveat, none of those laws reach backwards. The cameras and recorders that made up Mirai were mostly cheap devices from manufacturers that in many cases no longer exist, and homes and small businesses that never knew any of this happened. Many of them are still plugged in. Mirai variants are still being found scanning the internet today using the same technique because the technique still works. Mirai never really ended. Because the source code is public, it has been forked and rebuilt continuously ever since, and its descendants remain among the most commonly observed threats aimed at connected devices. There is no patch for a design decision made a decade ago by a manufacturer that has since gone out of business. And the raw scale of these attacks has kept climbing since 2016. What was a record-breaking event that year would not be a record now, or anything close to it. Which is the uncomfortable note to end the history on. The defenses got much better. The attacks got much bigger. And the underlying supply of badly secured devices never went away. What genuinely changed is narrower, and it is worth being precise about it. We stopped treating a single DNS provider as an acceptable dependency, and we started legislating the default password out of existence. Those are real wins. Neither of them was available on the 21st of October 2016, and both of them exist partly because of that day. So, 4 things to take away from this, and the first 2 you can do tonight. 1. Anything on your network with a camera, a microphone, or an internet connection has a login. Your router, your cameras, your recorder, your doorbell. If the password on it is the one it came with, change it. That single act is the entire defense against the technique in this episode. 2. Go into your router and look at the list of connected devices. Most people have never done this, and most people find something they had forgotten was there. You cannot secure a device you do not know you own. 3. If you build or run anything, ask the dying question. Where do all of my supposedly independent systems quietly meet? Every service here had redundancy, and every service here had the same single supplier underneath it. 4. Remember the retry storm. In a densely connected system, the failure is rarely the whole story. What the system does automatically in response to a failure can be far larger than the failure itself. And one thing to sit with, this was not sophisticated. There was no 0-day, no genius exploit, no state actor. It was factory passwords at scale against devices nobody thought of as computers. The internet was not beaten by something clever. It was beaten by a default setting. Next time on When Everything Went Down, an outage nobody could route around, because it happened inside the place everything else is built on. One region of one cloud provider in Northern Virginia goes down, and a startling share of the internet, including services that had never heard of it, goes down with it. That is us, East 1, and it is next. If this was worth your time, follow the channel. The whole series is being built here, 1 episode at a time.